The 2010 Atlanta Press Club debates, brought to you live from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Now, the Democratic race for Secretary of State.
Good evening. I'm John Sherrick, reporter for WXIA-TV in Atlanta. We'd like to welcome viewers at home as well as our live studio audience to the 2010 primary election campaign debates originating from the studios of GPB. Tonight's debate is organized by the Atlanta Press Club. Now let's meet the Democratic candidates facing each other in Georgia's Secretary of State primary election. They are in alphabetical order. Gail Buckner, she's a member of the Georgia General Assembly. Gary Horlacher is an attorney. Michael Mills is a public relations consultant, Angela Moore is a communications director, and Georganna Sinkfield is in real estate sales. Here's the format for tonight's debate. In the first round, each candidate will answer a question from one of our three panelists, and in the second round, the candidates will ask a question of one of their opponents. Each candidate will have time for rebuttal in this second round. And in the third round, the panelists will continue questioning the candidates, and finally, each candidate will have 60 seconds to make a closing statement. Now, before we get started, let's meet the three panelists selected by the Atlanta Press Club. First, we have Ray Matoyer, anchor for WNEG-TV in Athens. Next, we have Melissa Stiers, who is a reporter-producer for Georgia Public Broadcasting. And our final panelist is Dave Williams with the Atlanta Business Chronicle. He is their government reporter. Now let's get started with the debate. In the first round, each candidate will be asked a question by one of our panelists. The candidates have 30 seconds to answer each question. As moderator, I'll determine if a rebuttal is necessary. By random selection, Angela Moore gets the first question from Ray Matoyer.
Well, Angela, first question is the same question we asked the Secretary of State. They just filed a lawsuit, his office just filed a lawsuit last week challenging the federal government for approval of the Georgia's voter registration protections, which include checking on a person's citizenship. If you're elected as Secretary of State, would you continue with that lawsuit?
Absolutely not. I think it is a part of political grandstanding. I think it is restrictive. We are not only restricting minorities and low-income people, but we are restricting women. We're restricting people who are in rural Georgia as well. As I travel throughout the state of Georgia, I realize that it's not just African Americans and low income. It includes people who are in rural Georgia who have not had privilege to get a voter ID card or an identification card under the laws of Georgia.
Next, Melissa Stiers, question for Georganna Sinkfield.
Hi. What is your top priority in securing elections in Georgia?
What is my top priority for what?
In securing elections in Georgia.
My top priority would be to protect the rights, the voting rights of all citizens, to make sure that every vote is counted and the ballots are secured, and that we would have a voting mechanism by which we are sure that we can have good and correct counting of the ballots.
Thank you. Now, Dave Williams, your question for Gary Horlacher.
Mr. Horlacher, both Democrats and Republicans have endorsed requiring a verifiable paper trail on the touchscreen voting machines in Georgia, yet it hasn't happened during the last 4 years while the Secretary of State's office has been under Republican control. How would you ensure that another 4 years don't go by without adding a paper component to electronic voting?
Well, I've come up with two solutions. One of them is a traditional one, and that is going back to our scanned ballot. There is your verifiable paper ballot, and you use an electronic technology to compile the data. The other one I announced a few weeks back at the Reynolds Plantation Forum with all 7 candidates on the stage. The largest manufacturer of ATMs just moved their headquarters to this state. Why don't we team up with them and let that same technology used to produce ATMs receipts, use that for converting our electronic voting machines? NCR sure like the idea.
Thank you. Now, Ray Matoyer will have a question for Gail Buckner.
Recently, we just had a very confusing congressional election in Northeast Georgia, the congressional district that Nathan Deal vacated. You had the primary, then you had a runoff, then you had a special election, and now Mr. Graves, who won, now he has to run for re-election. What can the Secretary of State's office do to eliminate confusion about a race like that? Because a lot of people in Northeast Georgia thought they had already voted for it and the race is over.
Well, the first thing needs to happen with the citizens. They need to take a close look at who they are actually electing, that these individuals are dedicated and they will serve out the time that they are elected to do. In light of that, the Secretary of State does not have the ability to pass any laws. I would be more than willing to work with the General Assembly and the State Elections Board that we can put in place processes that would have to come through state law that we can eliminate a necessary time.
Our final question in this round comes from Melissa Stiers for Michael Mills.
Senate Bill 86 would require all new voters to present proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. Do you think this should be implemented?
Absolutely not. When I am Secretary of State, we will make sure that this law is not on the book and the lawsuit is gone. It's important to understand that we must have secure and accurate elections. But putting unnecessary barriers in front of people's path to participation is a problem. And frankly, we've created a lawsuit that doesn't have a problem. Study after study shows that there are not citizens or lack of non-citizens trying to fraudulently vote. It's just a problem that has been manufactured out of politics, and it will be gone when I'm Secretary of State.
That concludes round one. It's now time for our candidates to ask a question of one of their opponents. You'll have 15 seconds for the question, 30 seconds for the response, and 15 seconds for a rebuttal. By random selection, Michael Mills will ask the first question of one of his opponents.
I could ask this question of a few candidates on the panel, but we'll go with Mrs. Buckner. We've talked throughout the campaign about ethics in government and about good old-fashioned leadership at the office that's done through public service. My question is, how do you square that goal, which is laudable, with the effort of investing hundreds of thousands of dollars of your family's money into multiple campaigns to get this office?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. As a member of the General Assembly, you are not allowed to raise money when you are in session. And I did not make the decision to actually run for Secretary of State until the session was practically over. But in light of that, I won the nomination with 55% of the vote. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Mills.
Yeah, I think that's important that you made a decision late on, but the reality is that people have a problem with candidates and the role that money plays in elections. And so I think it's important that you answer that for the citizens of Georgia who will be voting.
Gary Horlacher, you may now ask a question of one of your opponents.
This question will also be directed to Ms. Buckner. One of the primary responsibilities of this office is overseeing our state election law. Can you explain to the voters of Georgia why you and all the other candidates except one on this stage has not filed their personal financial disclosure report and are therefore violating our state election law?
Well, Mr. Horlacher, you are mistaken about that item. If you will check with the State Elections Office, you will discover that I have filed every disclosure that has ever been required. Now, this is the second time that you have accused me of something that it simply takes just a few minutes to go on the internet and pull this information up. If that's the type of Secretary of State that you will be, then I think the citizens of this state will be disappointed in you.
Well, I have checked online, and a number of internet folks have reported on this. If you file for statewide office, you are required to file a personal financial disclosure report 7 days after qualifying. It doesn't matter if you were a legislator and filed earlier. You're wrong. You don't understand our state election law.
Now, Georganna Sinkfield will have a question for one of her opponents.
My question is directed at Mr. Mills. Mr. Mills, you have previously stated that you support excluding third-party and independent candidates from simply paying a qualifying fee to run for office rather than gathering signatures. However, each of us was able to pay a qualifying fee.
Your question, ma'am.
Can you explain why you feel it is appropriate or not to deny access to otherwise qualified candidates based on their party affiliation?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not quite sure where it came from. I've never said that. In fact, the only question I've been asked about getting a name on the ballot is the number of signatures that we have fair or not? And I said, I certainly think that's something that we need to investigate. Furthermore, I also have been the only candidate to say we need to look at including more people in the process, and we're going to do that by examining the State Elections Board, making sure that conflicts are removed by having the Secretary of State no longer vote on issues and bring in a third-party candidate to take that role of voting. So I am for increasing participation, and I'm not sure where you get that information.
Well, it comes from the source is the APN interview, and it was based on all interviews with all of us. And it definitely states that you would not have persons of other parties to pay a qualifying fee.
I think you may want to reread that interview because that was never asked.
No, this is strictly out of theirs.
Thank you both. Now, Gail Buckner will have a question for one of her opponents.
Well, my question will be for Mr. Horlacher. Sir, throughout this campaign, you have told us about how you have worked for Democratic candidates from top to bottom. You were employed by Democrats in 1999, but in the year 2000, you voted in the Republican primary. Could you not stay true to Democratic principles and support your Democrats in the Democratic primary?
Well, that's almost funny because, A, I don't think it's true, but B, if it is true, the only rationale would be if you live in Fayette County and you want to have a voice on certain local elections, the only choice often is a Republican ballot. Now, if I made that choice, that would be about the only reason I could think of to do it. And yes, I have been loyal to the Democratic team for over 30 years, and this is one fellow who does not have to make any apologies on that front.
Ms. Buckner?
Well, Mr. Horlacher, in light of your theme of telling the truth that you have displayed on the campaign trail and here again tonight, you are on record for voting in the Republican primary, and you seem to get foggy on things that when you are pinned down that you just can't seem to produce the correct information.
Thank you. Now, our final question in this round comes from Angela Moore.
Mr. Mills, Georgia law requires that we show a restrictive form of ID when we vote in person. Yet, it allows us to vote by absentee ballot with no evidence whatsoever or no ID whatsoever, but yet it allows us to get a voter identification card for free, yet we still have to show an ID. What specific steps would you take to untangle this web?
I think one of the most clear-cut issues here is that we talk about IDs that are required to participate in, and I think if that is going to be a law in the books, we should move forward with that, but it is critical that we make them available. If you go to the Secretary of State's website and find the state voter ID card, it talks about what the card allows you to do. It talks about why it matters and how you use it, but it doesn't tell you where to get it. So one of the first things we need to do is make sure that if we're going to require various forms of ID, we tell people how to get it and we make it accessible. I am for increasing participation in this state, and that is one of the critical steps we must take.
Again, what specific steps will you take to untangle the web? We have a crossover. It's very convoluted to the Georgia voters.
Well,
we need to make it consistent in all three.
We'll let that question be your rebuttal.
Answer that back
very
since
briefly.
she asked another question. I think I did answer it, and I'll stick to that, that we need to make sure that we tell people how to get those cards. But beyond that, we are going to create an elections task force that will study our system from top to bottom, starting on my first day, and we will make sure our voting system is in the 21st century and make sure that we empower people to participate.
I'm not sure you understood the question.
Thank you both. That concludes our second round of questioning for those who may be joining our program in progress. This is the debate among the candidates for Georgia's Secretary of State in the Democratic primary. For our third round, we'll return to our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidate of his or her choice. Candidates will be allowed 30 seconds to respond. As moderator, I'll determine if a rebuttal is necessary, and if so, they'll get 15 seconds. We begin this round with a question from Dave Williams.
This will be for Georganna Sinkfield. We've heard a lot in this campaign. It's also an issue the legislature took up this year on how we can make it easier in Georgia for our military personnel stationed overseas to vote absentee. Do you support what the legislature's done on that thus far, and how would you address the issue from the executive branch point of view as Secretary of State?
I definitely believe that the military should have the right to vote in every election. I also believe that the Secretary of State should certainly make sure that that voting is done appropriately and that we know who we are getting the absentee ballots from.
Ray Matoyer will now ask a question.
This question is for Mr. Mills. The previously elected Secretary of State, Karen Handel, got in trouble with the legislature because her office did not take furlough days as mandated by the governor and by the legislature. First of all, what's your reaction to that? And secondly, if you are elected Secretary of State and you're ordered to take furlough days, would you do that?
I'll take the second one first. Yes, if that's mandated by the General Assembly, we need to do that. Frankly, we're demanding that of people across the state, whether it's teachers, other state employees, and so we should follow through on that. You know, I think we won't go back and revisit history, but I think that's a continued pattern of Karen Handel doing what she wanted to do against the will of the people, against the will of the General Assembly. So we certainly don't need to go back there, but we will make sure that we work with our General Assembly. And also, I'll add that we're going to do a fiscal audit of the office day one to make sure that we're also using our resources responsibly.
Melissa Stiers will now ask a question.
My question is for Mr. Horlacher. The Secretary of State office is in charge of corporate registration and professional licensing. In past media interviews, you've called the process seriously flawed. What are those flaws and what will you do to correct them?
Well, on my 159-county tour, it was stunning to hear the anger ventilation among the citizens of Georgia. And, you know, this isn't political rhetoric. We saw a few weeks back an investigative reporter went online and in seconds hijacked the identity of a Georgia corporation with their permission and made himself the CEO. That part of technology is in dire need of upgrade. And when it comes to the licensing boards, you have to have more personal services. These automated phones are going to be thrown in the trash can, and we are going to start communicating with the citizens and the local government.
Now a question from Dave Williams.
This will be for Gail Buckner. Several years back in the General Assembly, you sponsored legislation to crack down on investment fraud in Georgia. How would you attack that issue as Secretary of State?
Well, preventing fraud is a critically important issue for Georgia citizens. And as Secretary of State, I would partner with law enforcement, business leaders, bankers, so that we can work together to prevent this type of crime. Typically, nothing is done until a crime is actually committed. We can do better than what we are doing in this state, and I plan to step forward and make that a top priority.
Now a question from Ray Matoyer.
This question is for Angela Moore. A lot of people in the state don't like the voting machines. If you're elected Secretary of State, would you keep the voting machines, number one? And number two, what would you do to make them work better?
Well, I would keep the machines because we actually own the machines, but we don't own the software. I would alleviate the current software provider of their responsibility, go to all the universities throughout the state of Georgia, bring the IT departments together, create our own software that Georgia owns using open source software that's less expensive. And I think that by utilizing our own software and putting paper evidence with it, as new technology will allow, it would secure our elections here and give us an authentic system of voting.
Thank you. And as moderator, I'd like to ask the other candidates what they think of the voting machines in Georgia. We'll start with Ms. Buckner and go right on down the row. Ms. Buckner.
Georgia does need a paper ballot. On day one, I will put in place a commission comprised of citizens, IT experts, corporate leaders. We will look at every aspect of the elections process, not just the electronic voting machines, because while this is an important issue, there are other elections issues out there that do need to be addressed. We don't know what technology is on the horizon, but Georgia citizens have expressed their desire to have a paper ballot.
Mr. Horlacher.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've offered two solutions already, and I sure like the response from the NCR executive who came up afterward and said that he thought combining that ATM solution with our current electronic voting machines was a good proposal, was doable, and think of the job creation in the state of Georgia using Georgia Corporation, and they already have a manufacturing facility here. Folks, it ain't rocket science. Whether you're a conspiracy theorist or not, how do you recount a vote if there is no paper trail? And the electronic machine is always going to come back with the same count.
Mr. Mills.
I'm sure the NCR executive was thrilled to hear that a potential member of the Secretary or the potential leader of the Secretary of State's office is offering contracts. I'm sure he was thrilled by that. I have been talking about since last July forming a commission on day one that will look at our system from top to bottom. It is critical that we do not have a knee-jerk response and say that our machines are fallible, we don't have a paper receipt, let's throw them out. In reality, it is no cost is too much to pay to have a secure system, but we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and so we'll study it, come up with a plan and a timeline to implement it.
Ms. Sinkfield.
Yes, I support creating a verifiable paper trail. However, given our circumstances in this state, we own the machines, we've paid for them, and also given the economy that we're under, I doubt that we will be able to replace those machines at this time. I also have found that there is no equipment that fits our machines to have a verifiable audit. So therefore, I will be willing to look at whatever is available electronically and all of the new data coming forth and see whether or not that will work.
Thank you. I believe Ray Matoyer has the next question.
I just had the last one.
Yes, you did. Ms. Stiers.
This question is for Gail Buckner. You've said that you think it's unfair that professional licensing fees are dropped into a general fund. What do you propose to do with them?
Well, I will, again, do a top-to-bottom audit of the Office of Secretary of State. I will look at every division. I will look at every aspect of this office. And it is unfair that these licensing fees go into the general fund. We will do a study to determine if this department is getting its fair share back. We have a situation now where citizens have lost jobs because this office has not turned licenses around in a timely manner. As Secretary of State, I will put an end to that.
Dave Williams.
This will be for Gary Horlacher, maybe something the other candidates could weigh in as well. Let's talk about ethics in government. You think enough about this issue to have taken a polygraph test as a candidate and vowed to take one once a year if you're elected to prove that you have not committed any wrongdoing ethically. What do you think about what the legislature has passed? Have they gone far enough on that issue?
No. And I think it's a clear illustration of how the culture of corruption has infected our capital, has sent this state into comatose condition, and that is why we are not answering the real questions facing our state. Folks, this fella meant it over a year ago, long before the Richardson tsunami hit the Gold Dome. Taking that polygraph exam was step one. Pledging to do it at the end of each calendar year, I think, is another step toward rebuilding the bridge of trust with the citizens of this state, and this fellow means it when it comes to ethics in government.
Thank you. I think Dave wanted to hear from all the candidates, so let's start at the other end this time. We'll begin with Ms. Sinkfield. What do you think about ethics in government and this idea of taking a polygraph to prove that you haven't done anything wrong?
Well, first of all, I think that ethics begins with personal integrity. And I believe as an elected official or in any business that we should have high standards of how we perform and have trust to our citizenship. I believe that my record of 28 years as a legislator speaks clearly of my stand on ethics and the manner in which I believe that is appropriate for all of us to abide by.
Angela Moore.
Well, I think that taking the polygraph test and showing Georgia is another portion of political grandstanding in that office, and it fails to attack the real situation for the office, and that's integrity in our elections and democracy. This office is where democracy starts, and rather than wasting taxpayers' dollars or his dollars and his time and the taxpayers' time, we need to concentrate on making sure that we secure our rights to democracy under the 15th Amendment.
Michael Mills.
I think Ms. Moore handled my answer to the polygraph. But what I will tell you, I've written a book on civic participation, did a grad school thesis on improving youth voter turnout, rolled up my sleeves, and organized people in the communities through a nonprofit that I started called Vote for America to engage people in the civic process. And through that, I have learned people do not participate when they don't have confidence in their system, when they don't have confidence in their elected officials. And to answer your question directly, the General Assembly ducked. It's like having the fox in the hen house, and they did not take the appropriate steps to instill confidence in their government.
Gail Buckner.
Taking a polygraph test does not necessarily mean that a person is straightforward when they are talking to the citizens, as we have seen here this evening. I do not need to take a polygraph test. The citizens of this state have seen me in action as a member of the General Assembly for 18 years, and they have the opportunity to engage me. I'm listed in the phone book under Charles and Gail Buckner. My website is gailbuckner.com. I welcome any questions.
Now a question from Ray Matoyer.
This is for Georganna Sinkfield. As long as I've been a reporter, people have come up to me and said, why do we have so many elections, federal, state, and local elections that are all going at different times? Seems like every time you look up, it's Tuesday. Are we supposed to vote this week? My question is, if you're elected to be the Secretary of State to that position, what could your office do? What would you think you could do to perhaps streamline that process if there's a way to work with the legislature to do that?
Well, first of all, I think that we certainly need to have more education for the citizens of Georgia in terms of the election process. However, as you stated, the Secretary of State does not set those standards. They are done by the legislature. Given the fact that I have worked with the legislature in leadership as well as chairs of many committees, that I would definitely work with them on trying to eliminate the confusion.
Thank you. Now a question from Melissa Stiers.
Angela Moore, according to your campaign materials, you want to replace our current voting machines with open source software. What does that do to ensure accuracy, and how will the state fund it?
Well, what it does is that when we use open source software, considering the fact that we spent well over $160 million on the current machines that fail to produce paper evidence that our vote counts, we do not own the equipment, we do not have an upgrade agreement, we do not have a maintenance agreement. It is in place there for us to get our software the least economical way, and it is secure. It is what the federal government uses right now, and it is something that we can use to tailor down to Georgia to produce secure elections here in the state of Georgia.
Now to Dave Williams with a question.
This will be for Michael Mills. You touched on earlier briefly, but I want you to elaborate on it, the need to reconfigure the state elections board. What do you believe is wrong with the current makeup, and how would you change it?
Yeah, I think we've touched on people having confidence in their government. And so there is perceived conflicts of interest, as we heard of talking about companies with NCR and others who could lead our election software. People need to have confidence. And so I'm a little bit troubled that the Secretary of State casts a vote on that state elections board. And so what I would propose doing is having that person oversee the board, much like the Lieutenant Governor does with Georgia's state Senate, but electing, just like we would the Democrat and Republican candidate, electing a party from the third party that had the most votes the last time as the replacement for that vote on the board.
Mr. Mills, thank you. Now to Ray Matoyer.
This question is for Mr. Horlacher. The state of Georgia has had month after month of tax collections that are in the red, and there are also a number of businesses in this state that aren't paying taxes the way they should. The Secretary of State's office is one of the only offices that really keeps track of all the businesses in the state. What can you do if you're elected as Secretary of State to help ensure that you're working with other entities to help with the tax collection issue?
That's a good question, in that what the Secretary can do is team up with the Governor and team up with the Revenue Department and make sure that even what the Revenue Department has finally acknowledged, that there may be somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion of uncollected sales tax, and given the holes that have been shot into our budget through all the special interest tax credits, folks, if we team up, if we really work together, if we cross-match those databases, I think we can genuinely start tracking some revenue in this state.
Our final question in this round comes from Melissa Stiers.
Michael Mills, you've devised a plan for election reform that includes creating a task force to oversee an audit in the election process to eventually establish a paper trail, and also you propose creating a new K-12 curricula to increase civic participation. How will the state fund this in tight budget years?
Yeah, you know, the first thing we're going to do is that green audit, and it's a little bit of a double entendre. We're going to do a financial audit from day one that looks at how are we using our resources, our multiple offices around the state, the vehicles vehicles that we have, our staff and personnel, and make sure that we are as fiscally responsible as possible. And I suspect we will find some funds there. But a lot of this, particularly the K through 12 piece, isn't something that costs money. That means standing up as Secretary of State and saying, I'm not satisfied with 65% participation in a presidential election, and I, as the state's chief elections officer, am going to do my part to empower people to participate. So a lot of it doesn't have to cost money. It means standing up as a leader.
We have time for no more questions. Each of the Democratic candidates in the primary for the Secretary of State will now have 60 seconds for a closing statement. Michael Mills was randomly selected to make the first statement.
Thank you very much to the Atlanta Press Club, Georgia Public Broadcasting, for hosting our debate. My name is Michael Mills, and I'm running to bring a new way forward in Georgia. That means inspiring and empowering people to participate in their government, but also giving them a government that works. At the end of the day, I see this office very differently than my opponents. We must do more than merely administer elections. We must do more than merely administer the paperwork of government. That's why the proof is too real and the stakes are too high, that our rights are under attack, that we're losing jobs. We must elect a Democrat who can stand up for our rights and protect them at the voting booth, who can stand up and create jobs, and more importantly, stand up against Republicans in November. My name is Michael Mills. I am that candidate. I ask for your vote on July 20th. Thank you very much. Visit michaelmills2010.com.
Now Gary Horlacher will give his closing statement.
Thank you. Folks, as you've heard this evening, the services of this office are very important, and as I heard on my 159 county tour, they are in dire need of repair. But the bottom line for this fella is going to continue to be banging that drum on ethics in government. Until we rebuild that bridge of trust with the citizens of this state, that is step one to getting this state back in gear. Now, elections are very interesting in that this is the only time where you, the voters of this state, are the commander-in-chief. You get to choose the troops that are going to that trench and start fighting to resolve the serious problems facing our state. Georgia, it is up to us to unite. You want to fight the power under the Gold Dome? You need the power to fight. And as Commander-in-Chief, I hope this is one soldier who you will enlist, and Gary for Secretary will sure go to work. Thank you.
Georganna Sinkfield will now give her closing statement.
I'd like to thank the Atlanta Press Club, and to my fellow Georgians, I ask for your support for me as Secretary of State for the Democratic primary on July the 20th. A vote for me is to vote for experience, dedication, and trusted leadership, which I have demonstrated for the past 28 years, and it also makes me the longest-serving woman in the history of the General Assembly. I also have stood for families and children and the elderly to make their lives across the state a better one. I would ask that you think of the trust, the experience, and the dedication in this office that I would bring to the Secretary of State, and that would be to have fair and honest elections, to protect the voting rights of our citizens, to end fraud and abuse. And I say to you once more, my name is Georganna Sinkfield, and I ask for your support for Secretary of State in the Democratic primary.
Our next closing statement comes from Gail Buckner.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. I am Gail Buckner, and I am a candidate for Secretary of State because I believe in the honor of public service. During the 18 years that I have been elected to the General Assembly, I have worked in areas relevant to the Office of Secretary of State: elections, professional licensing, corporations, and archives. I've authored legislation to impact elections. I've been recognized by the Friends of the Archives for legislation that I passed protecting state documents. This office touches the lives of Georgia citizens every day. You will find me in the front office working as a servant leader. We will deliver service that exceeds expectation. We will help create jobs. We will help fight fraud in this state. I humbly ask for your vote and your prayers, and may God bless Georgia.
And our final closing statement comes from Angela Moore.
The office of Secretary is not a legislative nor a judicial office. It is an office that conducts the business for the people of Georgia as prescribed by constitutional law. If we're to usher in a new era of civility to the state of Georgia, then we must elect leaders who will put the business of Georgians first and stop political grandstanding. As an advocate for democracy and election integrity, and as a woman of color whose relatives and ancestors were denied the right to vote, I am the only candidate in this race who believes in the constitutional right to everyone to an unbiased and authentic system of voting. As your secretary, I will campaign for the establishment of authentic and verifiable voting, and that voting system will be the ballot of record. By doing anything less or anything less.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. And we'd like to thank all of our candidates once again. They are Gail Buckner, Gary Horlacher, Michael Mills, Angela Moore, and Georganna Sinkfield. And we'd like to thank our panelists once again, Ray Matoyer from WNEG-TV, Melissa Stiers from Georgia Public Broadcasting, and Dave Williams from the Atlanta Business Chronicle. And remember, everyone, the primary elections are on July 20th, so vote. And our thanks again to the candidates and to our panel. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging tonight's debate. For more information about the Press Club, you may visit atlantapressclub.org. The debates that air on Georgia Public Broadcasting will be archived on the Press Club's website. I'm John Schierick. Thanks for joining us for this primary election debate, and we invite you to tune in to GPB at 7 p.m. on Friday, July 9th, when this series of debates continues.
The Atlanta Press Club debate series is made possible by a donation from the late Tom Watson Brown.